Welcome back to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Barry, it is a pleasure to have you back, the man who does not really need an introduction, but I'm gonna let you introduce yourself anyway.
Thank you, Robbie. It's nice to be invited. I appreciate it. And my name is Barry Jones, and I am a high school history teacher. Been a high school history teacher since 1997, mostly in the state of Tennessee, but I've been in other places as well. And I've been a lot of places because I was a high school basketball coach. And if anybody knows what that career field is like, that you are hired to be fired. So I've been a lot of places, but anyway, I've been researching the JFK assassination. I really didn't start off researching the JFK assassination. I started off with an interest in Watergate, and in the attempt to answer the question why, I had to begin going back. It took me back to 1963 and the assassination. And that's how I got hooked. It was Watergate that got me hooked into the JFK assassination. I've been researching it ever since. I have a website, sphistory.com. I make content available there for homeschool kids and teachers and families and parents. I also have some books and podcasts and things of that nature. And I do a YouTube channel 5 days a week, Standards Plus History Academy on YouTube, all about this topic.
You mentioned something off air, which was that there was something 10 years ago that you would have never thought could have been possible in the assassination. And then you kind of start changing your perspective when you're addressed with new information. And that was about the Secret Service. Now, are there other areas like that in the assassination that you've had to change your scope on? I mean, I've become a little bit more open to. It's not that I'm not looking at the information or not trying to find it, but there's a lot of researchers, especially when you're soaking up through oral history like I've been doing from other researchers, there's things that don't get addressed based on a certain bias or a certain thing. The mob connections, the interesting background with how JFK is involved in so much before he even gets into office, which I'm sure we're going to discuss on this episode. But there's a lot that starts to be areas people won't touch because they might have a certain identity or certain relationship they feel with JFK as a president, whether it's in favor of him or whether it's against him. And same thing with LBJ as well, too. The people that want to blame LBJ for everything or people that say that he had no involvement in it. There's always a bias in something. And when you're soaking up your information, it's best to get it from various sources. And you seem to be one that'll be more than happy to address the mob connected activities, the way Kennedy got elected, and a lot of things that necessarily researchers won't even touch. It's kind of like the scandals and stuff. People don't like talking about affairs when it comes to JFK, even though I think that's culturally, I guess, pop trendy of what a lot of people might know him by.
Well, when you get into this topic, you sort of become a JFK apologist. And to have a balanced view, I learned this from Fletcher Prouty. Fletcher Prouty was really good at keeping a balanced view, saying, okay, here's what the deep state saw when they looked at JFK. They saw a threat to national security. And here's why. And if you put yourself in their shoes, you can kind of almost get it. The Secret Service saw a guy who was hooked on drugs, meth, other drugs, and you could put, if you put yourself in their shoes, you could see where someone might be compromised chemically, have a chemical imbalance due to drugs because of his health problems, and they would think he'd be a threat to national security. So you come away with a completely different perspective, not that it whitewashes or excuses or justifies what happened, but you can kind of see where they were coming from. Oh, you asked about change. When I was starting off with Watergate, I was operating under the assumption that Nixon did everything that he was accused of. And boy, what a revelation it's been to me over the last 2 decades to learn that that was a setup by the CIA. The whole thing was an entrapped setup. And from Bob Woodward, the ex-ONI officer, to the Deep Throat, or Deep Throats, plural. I really think there were two of them. To the crew that was operating the White House tapes, to the people that had infiltrated the plumbers and his White House and creep. I mean, Nixon was surrounded by snakes. And it was all because of the same reason. It really goes to the same motive. Anyone who tried to make peace during the Cold War with the Soviets became a threat to the national security apparatus and all the corporations that feed it, the deep state. So I've learned a lot. That has changed my view on Watergate. And another thing, I think, here recently, for example, uh, it's been really eye-opening to me over the last probably 5, 6 years. I used to divide all these conspirators, plural, into different categories. I'd have the deep state over here. I have the CIA. I'd have the mob over here. I'd have the Cubans over here. LBJ over, and they all had their separate categories. And what I've learned is uh, most of them, there were so many overlaps that most of them were like two heads of the same coin. For example, the CIA, the mob, and the Cubans. The CIA strategically made all the plans. The money came from the mob, and the foot soldiers were the Cubans. They're all working for the same purpose. So when you say, yeah, there were three conspirators and you divide them into, really there weren't. They were all operating as one. So that's really helped me understand the big picture. Another thing I've learned here recently, really fantastic book came out recently, Mary Haverstick, about a woman I know. It's called A Woman I Know. And she really gets into it's this relationship this reporter had with an actual CIA agent who was in Dallas. She was a pilot and she was at Redbird Airfield on the day JFK was assassinated. And that's piqued her interest. She began really studying this lady and found out some things. And the big revelation to me in her book was what ZR Rifle was all about. I had no, I had kind of wrapped ZR Rifle in one big bundle with executive action, and I thought it was all the same. These are two separate assassination programs. One was domestic and one was foreign. And I just didn't know that. So I think if you, as a researcher, if that's what you call yourself, uh, you always have to be open to new information. And the day that you get married to one set of facts as you interpret them, and you're not open to anything new that might come out. Now you got to be careful because some of the new information is put out there by the intelligence branches like the CIA. This recent information from the Secret Service agent, that's just a limited hangout. That's they're doing that. There's always a reason behind that. Usually it involves diversion or some sort of cover up. You preserve your narrative largely and you dribble out some information because new facts have come out. You can't hang on to your old information. You can't hang on to your old position and still be considered credible. So I handle that differently, but new information that comes out from researchers, and you got to be open to that. And this Haverstick thing was really groundbreaking for me with the ZR Rifle stuff. And there's always new stuff coming out. Whenever a new document comes out, you learn something new. So Jefferson Morley has a website. He puts a JFK fact. I subscribe to it, and I get an email from him every day. And he's about as plugged in as they come. And so I'll get a lot of it I already know, but every now and then I'll get an email about something. It's not always from him, but it's from his website. Some contributor might have contributed. And it's some little piece of little information that is a puzzle piece that in my mind I've been wrestling with, and it fits in there and completes the picture. So I just think we're all on a journey. This is what I tell my listeners on my YouTube channel. Listen, comment. If you know something I don't know, comment. And let's get a discussion going, because that's how we learn. And so it's been a journey. Been I started this in 97. So however many years that is, it's getting close to 30. But it's been a journey.
What's your, I guess, least looked into theory? The one that you just couldn't get with the most? LBJ,
Okay, well, I
Mafia.
heard this one actually on your channel. A guy was
Whoops.
talking. Well, no, you were just interviewing the guy, and he said Israel did it. The
Oh
Muslims.
God, not that one, please. I'm not. That's it. I'll get banned off YouTube. Just don't even.
I had not heard that. So that was that. And then sometimes I get this people that want to say that. In fact, I had a guy get sort of short with me on my channel because I just didn't go with what he was saying. He's convinced that the driver of the limo turned around and shot the president.
A lot of people believe in that. I don't know where it came from, though.
And my point to him was, okay, well, let's just assume that that's true. Where would the spray from the headshot, where would it go? If he's sitting in the left front and he turns and aims at the right rear, where would the spray go? It would go over the right side of the limo trunk and out onto the motorcycle who's following up behind. But it didn't. All the spray went over the left side of the limo trunk and hit and covered up the visor and the reflecting glass on the motorcycle on the left side. It was the left side that was impacted. And since it's a frangible bullet and it creates this huge gaping exit wound, all that spray indicates from the direction from which the shot came. And if you watch the reaction of there are only four motorcycles. If you watch the reaction of the four motorcycles, it's really telling. The two motorcycles on the left side of the rear of the car, they both get up and run up towards the grassy knoll because as they're driving, they're looking in that direction as they're watching the limo. But the two guys on the motorcycles on the right, which are looking left at the limo, they don't react at all. They just continue driving with the limo. They go all the way to Parkland Hospital with the limo. But the two on the left, one of them throws down his bike and runs up the knoll. The other one drove his motorcycle up the knoll. So in real time, you can see, and this was my point to the guy. I said, how could any of that have happened if the shot came from inside the car from the left front? None of what we just described would happen. And, you know, that's just my common sense kicking in. I don't have any evidence of all, I'm just noticing things, questioning. But those are the two that I hear the most. I don't hear the Mossad one very often.
Okay, that's a rare
I
one.
mean, I've been studying that for 25 years, almost 30, and that's the first time I had heard that. And but I have heard it since then from other people. Maybe my radar's, looking for it now, but the one about the Secret Service driver, you hear that a lot. And there are various others. Those are the two that stick out in my mind the most.
What about instead of looking at the assassination, we talk about some of the pre-things before Kennedy got into office, the situation that was going on there? Because obviously, when you're looking at all these varying theories and anything that's like the Kennedy assassination, you have to address the fact that it's been picked over probably more than any other event we've ever had through history. So you're going to come up with a lot of strange connections. Some names that pop up like Sam Giancana and JFK sharing the same girl in a sense. That's something researchers don't really talk about, but it's a real thing. And it's mentioned in various different documents. It was actually a warning that JFK had to cut off this relationship with this girl because of the connections with Sam Giancana. That's printed in multiple government documents. So let's start addressing and going into some of that a little bit. How did all these connections, these mob connections, before JFK even became into being the president?
Prohibition changed our country. I was having a discussion with my wife the other night. We were on a walk, and I said, this is going to sound really sexist. I said, but think about if you're a World War I soldier and you're returning from World War. Think about all the changes that are happening or have happened in your country while you were away. First of all, women got prohibition passed, which means now you want to come home after the war and celebrate, but you can't because not the way that you thought you were going to. You wanted to drink alcohol, but now you can't. It's illegal. Secondly, women are on the verge of getting the right to vote, and women outnumber men. And thirdly, a lot of the jobs that men thought they were coming back to, women had the jobs, and the factory owners wanted to keep the women in the jobs because they were cheaper. So if you're a man returning from World War I, you can't drink. Women now outvote you, and you can't get your job back. And so we talk about this in my class. We just say, hey, think about the gender wars that began occurring between World War I and World War II and really took off after World War II. This might be part of the reason. Now, prohibition doesn't last because it's such a disaster. It created organized crime. It took crime which was not organized and turned it into, because there was so much money to be made, some people got uh, the idea, why don't we organize by city or by crime families and divide this nation into territories and provide something that everybody still wants, but no one's willing to take the risk to do it because it's now against the law, but we're willing to take that risk. And one of the guys who was willing to get involved in that was Joe Kennedy Sr. And of course, if you're going to get into that line of work, you have to do it with the blessing. You have to do it in cooperation with or in partnership with the local crime family. And in his case, it was Frank Costello out of New York. Frank Costello, just for a frame of reference, he is the character. He was known as they called him I think they called not the ambassador, they called him the prime minister, because he was always so snappy the way he dressed, and he just had that air about him. And he ran pretty much all of the Canadian whiskey into New York and the East Coast. And he allowed Joe Kennedy together, they smuggled Canadian whiskey across the border into Boston and all down the East Coast. And by the way, Frank Costello, I started to say this, he's the character that the movie Godfather is originally based on. So the original Don is supposed to be Frank Costello. So anyway, Joe Kennedy, during a period in which the rest of the country is starving and it's the Great Depression, everyone is impoverished. He increased his family fortune from $4 million to $180 million. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot of money today, but this is the 1920, this is the 20s and 30s. That's a ton of money.
Especially when the banks are collapsing.
Right. He turns his family into a dynasty almost overnight because of prohibition. So much money to be made. But again, it was through the partnership that he had with Frank Costello and the mob that he was able to do that. Now when prohibition ended, what Joe Kennedy did, in keeping with that same kind of like that Godfather, uh, the movie The Godfather, where Michael Corleone tries to legitimize the family business. That's what Joe Kennedy set out to do, to legitimize the family business. And he begins opening, he's got all this money now, so he converts his rum running operation into Somerset Industries, which is now a legitimate company. And he is the major supplier on the East Coast of Canadian whiskey and other alcohol products. And he also buys the Merchandise Mart in Chicago and kind of becomes like the Clay Shaw of Chicago. If you're familiar with Clay Shaw, he owned the Merchandise Trade Mart down in New Orleans. So these are entry points into the United States where trade can come in, and they're in charge of that. Well, in order to do business in Chicago in those days, you had to get partnership, or you had to partner or get permission from the local crime family. They ran the city, and that was Sam Giancana. So in two cases, we see Joe Kennedy partnering with organized crime, first during Prohibition to make his money, and second, after Prohibition, when he's trying to legitimize so that he can open a legitimate industry or business in Chicago. Now, that another way that he tried to legitimize was to become a big donator or contributor to the Democrat Party. He's Irish Catholic. In Boston, if you're not Democrat, you're not alive. So he picks his Democrat friends to start contributing to, and he becomes quickly known as, quote, Donor Joe. I mean, he gives a lot of money to the Democrat Party. Of course, that buys you influence. FDR eventually appointed him, because of his position as one of the biggest contributors to the Democrat Party. He appoints him to be the ambassador over in England. And this is in the lead up to World War II. This is the next big war. And of course, the big issue in that time was Hitler. And Hitler's violating the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, and he's taking back land like the Rhineland from, and he's talking about living space, and he annexes Austria, and he's threatening all the neighboring nations around him. And Neville Chamberlain, who is, he's like he and Joe Kennedy are sort of like simpatico on this issue. Neither one wants another world war, and you can understand that. The the Versailles Treaty was so poorly constructed, it almost, you can look back now and see how it set in motion World War II. We won the war, but we lost the peace. But guys like Neville Chamberlain are clinging desperately to the hope that they can prevent another world war. And Joe Kennedy has a personal reason. He realizes another world war, he's got three, possibly four, if the timing hits just right, draft eligible sons, starting with Joe Jr., and then Jack, and then Bobby, and Teddy would be too young. So I'd say three, two for sure, three possibly, but fourth is too young. And so he's got a personal reason not to want to have another world war. And anyway, long story short, Joe Kennedy ends up being a pretty close advisor during this period of time to Neville Chamberlain. And when Neville Chamberlain goes to Munich to try to negotiate a peaceful settlement over the issue of Czechoslovakia, and comes back and waves that note when he lands on the airplane, waves that agreement that Hitler signed his name to, saying there will be peace in our time, peace in our time. Hitler has agreed. You know, we gave him the Sudetenland, which is part of Czechoslovakia. It's the German-speaking part, but he has promised no more invasions of any other countries. And everyone was happy at the time. And at the time, they were like telling Winston Churchill to keep his mouth shut, because Winston Churchill was the only guy in Europe at the time saying, you can't trust Hitler. You can't trust him. Don't trust him. And they basically said, shut up and go away. And Neville Chamberlain becomes the big hero. Well, within 6 months, Hitler invades the rest of Czechoslovakia. And now Neville Chamberlain looks like an idiot. They call him an appeaser. And the guy who was his closest advisor during this time was Joe Kennedy. And Joe Kennedy had made some very public comments that made it into the newspapers and made it back stateside, that when Hitler starts exhibiting this very aggressive behavior and the appeasers looked like idiots, it really embarrassed FDR. And they had to fire him. I mean, they say it was a reassignment or they recalled him, but they fired him.
Was that the
And that was,
committee? Was that the committee he was in charge of? He was in charge of a committee, and it was really strange how this guy who had no political career before that, just a large amount of influence, was somehow in charge of like an important committee that he, I think, was eventually taken off of.
yeah. Well, they actually lived, the Kennedy family lived for a period of time in London because he was the actual ambassador. And when he started making when you're an ambassador, you're allowed to make public comments, but it all has to be green lighted or approved in advance from the White House. You have to there's got to be a united front. And some of the things that he was saying didn't line up with what FDR was saying or people back home were saying. So anyway, Joe Kennedy's dream, I didn't mention this, but his dream was to take this ambassadorship and translate it into the presidency. He really thought this was FDR's second term. He really thought FDR would keep to the two-term, sort of like the unspoken gentleman's agreement, to tradition of the precedent of the two-term, and he wouldn't run again. But we all know what happened. Well, so he was going to run. That was his plan. Well, when this happens with the appeasement smear, and then when FDR fires him, and then FDR decides to run for a third term, all that together created a perfect Joe Kennedy's political career was over. And it even comes up against JFK years later. LBJ brings it up in the 60 primary when he's running against JFK. He brings up Joe Kennedy, his daddy's appeasement, as a smear against JFK. This was something his sons had to battle back against. One of the reasons why, when JFK's trying to make peace with the Soviets and signs the nuclear limited test ban treaty and back channels with Khrushchev and starts back channeling with Castro, the national security apparatus says, oh, he's just doing what his daddy did. He's an appeaser just like his daddy was. It got hung around the Kennedy neck, all the necks of the boys, what their daddy did.
That's exactly what people say, is that the boys paid for the sins of the father.
Yeah, yeah, and that's from a political standpoint. But how about in the 60 election? When the World War II does break out, Joe Senior's ambition was really poured into his oldest son. Joe Jr. was the most like Joe Sr. Joe Sr. was a crass guy. He had affairs flaunted his affairs right in front of his wife. They were a Catholic family. She was never going to leave him. They had a lot of kids. So he just did what he wanted. He was all about money. And the way he's, you've probably heard the story about his daughter. She was a wild child. He had her undergo a lobotomy.
Lobotomized. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, just basically turned his own daughter into a vegetable. He was just that kind of a character. And some
That's
people might call,
Rosemary, right? Rosemary.
right, right. Some people might call him a sociopath. And the oldest son, Joe Sr. or Jr., was the most like his daddy. And so his daddy was very proud of his oldest son. Well, he gets killed in World War II. Over the skies of England, his plane blows up. He goes on some super secret mission, and over the skies of England, it's really never been, I've never seen any conclusive research on why the plane blew up. They really don't know, but it did, and it killed him. So, and then JFK almost dies himself. He serves, and you know the story of the PT-109 boat, and it gets cut in half, and he swims to Plum Island and takes his crew with him. He's got the life preserver of his best friend in his teeth, and he's dragging him because he's injured. There's a lot of physical things JFK couldn't do, but one thing he could do, he could swim. And in the middle of the night, in oil-filled waters, waters infested with sharks and gators, he took his crew and saved their lives to Plum Island in the middle of the night when they couldn't even see where they were swimming. I mean, he's a legitimate war hero. And it surprised even his daddy. His daddy, he'd been dealing with these health problems his whole life. He was weak. His daddy just did not have the hopes that JFK could ever be what he was or what his oldest son could be. But now he doesn't have any choice. Joe Jr.'s dead. So when he returns from World War II, now he's a war hero. The Joe Sr.'s doing the math. He said, well, we could turn this into a political career here. So he just basically tells Jack, you're running for Congress. And he runs the campaign. And if you see pictures of Jack when he runs that first, he looks like a baby. I mean, he's got the big pompadour haircut, and he just looks like a baby. And Bobby's helping him. And Bobby looks even younger because he is younger. Anyway, then it becomes pretty apparent he's going to run for Senate and open it. And in Massachusetts, if you're a Democrat and you're at Kennedy, you got a lot of tailwinds behind you. They're going to help you. He wins that Senate election, serves one term, and he's still relatively young. He's the nation doesn't really know him. The Massachusetts folks, the Northeasterners know him, but one of the things that really put him on the map was serving on that McClellan committee in the late 50s with his brother. And of course, this just aggravates Daddy to no end because they're going after organized crime, they're going after organized labor. And Joe Sr. knows his family history better than they do. And he knows this is not good. You don't go after organized crime and get away with it. They had some knockdown drag, especially with Bobby. Bobby had this savior concept, this mentality. He wanted to save the Kennedy family name from what his daddy had turned it into. He oftentimes compared his daddy to Henry IV, the old Shakespeare play, The Poisoned Inheritance, where he made a fortune and he did all these great things, but when he gave it to his kids, it was poisoned because it came from a poisoned tree. And he said, that's my dad. And we're paying for all his connections. And he's telling us not to do all these things because of the connections, how we made our money and how we got powerful and all that kind of stuff. But Bobby he was a true believer, and he thought it was his mission in life. He was going to clean up the family name. He was going to be the Michael Corleone that truly legitimized the family name. JFK was kind of ambivalent about that. Bobby was the driver. So you get in the late 50s in that Senate committee, and Bobby and Jack are causing all kinds of problems for organized crime and such. Well, Joe had already made the decision that JFK was going to run for president in 60. And he knows, all right, here regionally, he won't have any problems. A Kennedy won't have any problems. The Democrat won't have any problems. But in the South, how in the world is my son, a Northeastern liberal, a Kennedy Northeastern liberal, going to get the solid South, which is, that's all controlled by Democrats? How is he going to get the South to vote for them? How in the world is that going to happen? And he's a Catholic. The voters have never put a Catholic in the White House. And so you got that. You got daddy's reputation, that will ultimately get thrown in JFK's face. You got some things you got to overcome. Now he's going to be running against a guy if he wins the Democrat nomination. That's the first key. A lot of people just think like it was a foregone conclusion he was going to win the Democrat nomination. It's not true. It's not true. He very easily could have lost that. But let's just say he's thinking ahead. Even if he wins the Democrat nomination, he's going to be running against a very popular, well-known national candidate, Richard Nixon, who's also young. No matter which one of the two of them win, you're going to have a changeover from one old generation, Eisenhower, to the new generation, young. But he is benefiting from serving as vice president for the last 8 years. He is benefiting from Eisenhower's very popularity. And so he's going to have a hard time winning. But first things first, he's got to win the nomination. And so Joe decides to go and call on those people that had basically put him on the map to help his son win election in 1960. First, he's got to win the primary. So he sets up a meeting in Chicago, and it's through Judge Touhy. Now, Judge Touhy and him have a relationship. Now, Judge Touhy is not a crook. He's not conflicted. He's not compromised. This is a legitimate judge, has a very good, honest reputation in Chicago. But he knows Joe because Joe has financially helped Judge Touhy and his family on several occasions as owner of the merchandise mart. And so you could make the argument that Judge Touhy owes Joe Kennedy a favor because Joe has financially backed him on several business ventures and things. So he goes to Judge Touhy and he says, I need to arrange a meeting through you with Sam Giancana. I know you have several attorneys that are constantly in front of you at court that are his mob attorneys. I know that you can get word to him that we need to have a meeting. And so I'm counting on you to set up this meeting. So Judge Touhy sets up the meeting. He goes through one of these mob attorneys who was married to Sam Giancana's granddaughter. They work it out. And Sam Giancana and Joe Kennedy Sr. meet in Judge Touhy's court chambers back in his office. And they hammer out a deal. And the deal is, if you'll help my son win this election in 60, which is going to involve a two-step process. You're going to help him win the primaries first. And then secondly, you're going to have to help him win the general. If you'll do that on the back end, after we win, you will have a friend in the White House, which means the Justice Department will no longer be going after organized crime. And all of these depositions and these open hearings and subpoenas, all that kind of stuff, the harassment, the surveillance, all that stuff goes away. You have a friend in the White House, and organized crime is free to go what they do best, which is make money. That's number one. And number two, if it comes to the point where Castro overthrows Batista in Cuba and kicks all the mafiosos out in Cuba, we will overthrow Castro and reopen Cuba for business, which of course, in those days, Cuba was Las Vegas before Las Vegas. And that's where the mafiosos made all their money. They had the casinos, the hotels, they had the brothels, all the gambling, and they had a sweetheart deal down there with Batista. And as long as they kicked back enough upstairs to him, it was the rich man's playground. You're away from the Justice Department. You're away from U.S. law. You don't have to pay U.S. taxes on any of that income. It's over. That was their gravy train. But if the revolution goes the wrong way, Castro's already said Cuba is for Cubans. He's going to kick all the mafiosos out. So Joe Kennedy knew this. And he says, that's the deal. If you'll help my son be president, I will make sure Cuba stays open for you, and I will make sure you have a friend in the White House. And so the first real test of this it's really interesting, Robbie, because Sam goes back to the rest of the crime syndicate and he has to convince them to go along with this deal. So you're talking about Carlos Marcello down in New Orleans. You're talking about Santos Trafficante. You're talking about uh, Costello. You're talking about the New York, the Chicago, the New Orleans, the Florida, all these different crime families. And Carlos Marcello cannot stand the Kennedys. Absolutely can't. It's a visceral hatred between him and Bobby. He insulted him. All these guys have been hauled in front of the McClellan committee, and Bobby has just insulted them left and right, upside down the other. And it's a sales job by Sam Giancana. But the mafia, if they're one thing, they are survivors, and they will do business. It's like that old saying you see in every mob movie. It's nothing personal. It's just business. It's nothing personal. They had to lay aside their personal animus for the Kennedys. And it wasn't just organized crime, it was organized labor. The Teamsters Union in Chicago, the Teamsters were paying for all the construction projects that the Chicago outfit was doing out in Las Vegas. That's where the Chicago outfit got all their money. And who was running the Teamsters? Jimmy Hoffa. And who was getting hauled in front of the McClellan committee because of that connection? It was Jimmy Hoffa. And
Why
there
did
was a war there.
why did Jimmy Hoffa get pardoned by Nixon?
Well, because in the 60 election, he gave $500,000 to Nixon's campaign, as did Carlos Marcello. That's interesting how they threaded that needle. As a unit, as a group, as an entity, organized crime, organized labor, all that ball of wax, they supported Kennedy. But individually, Carlos Marcello gave $500,000 cash to Nixon. Individually, Jimmy Hoffa gave $500,000 to Nixon. That was the only way they could make sense of what they were doing. It drove Hoffa crazy. He has all this Teamsters money that is flowing in out of my pension fund to you people. He's talking to Sam. I know it's going to help Kennedy win the election, and I can't stand Kennedy.
Because it's also what had them pissed off at Sam Giancana, because Sam Giancana at the same time was donating money to Kennedy's campaign. So whatever money Sam Giancana was donating to Kennedy's campaign, the other guys that were donating to Nixon's campaign was doing the opposite work. So it was like if you donated $500,000 and let's say Sam Giancana donated 50,000, you're really donating 450,000.
Well, if you understand the place that they're in, as a group, the crime families cast their lot Kennedy's because, and I've often wondered this, and I've heard it discussed, and I've never really heard it answered satisfactorily until recently. I was listening to a discussion, and I don't even remember where I heard it, and the light bulb went on. So the question is, why would organized crime take a chance and support Kennedy when they already have a sure thing in Nixon? Why would they do that? Nixon is busy right now as vice president running all these covert ops against Castro, and he's committed to the cause to make sure Castro never, he doesn't last in Cuba. He's committed. He's got all kinds of ties back to organized crime himself. I mean, they're long and they're deep, and they already have a friend in the White House. So why would they switch allegiances in midstream and go to Kennedy's side? They're literally getting, if Nixon wins and he's the favorite, they already have a friend in the White House, and they already have a guy who's committed to getting rid of Castro. Why would they go with Kennedy? It doesn't even make sense until you realize that if Kennedy loses, he goes back to the Senate with his brother Bobby,
Oh
and
God, I know this. Yeah.
the McClellan committee continue because now
Did you listen to Eric
Nixon.
Wilson's episode? That's the only place and person I've talked to who's ever articulated that. And I haven't heard it anywhere. So you must have heard it off of me, or you must have heard it off of Eric Wilson, but
It
that
could
was
be.
his
It could be.
theory.
Well, it's more than a theory because it would be divided government. You'd have a Republican president, but you'd have a Democrat-controlled Senate. They're not going to do what Nixon wants them to do.
Well, he would just persecute the mob even more.
They would just keep persecuting the mob. You still have to deal with the Kennedy brothers. But if you have a Kennedy in the White House, that's a Democrat administration and a Democrat Senate. They're going to do whatever Kennedy tells them to do. And so now you have a friend in the White House who can actually shut down all the problems the Senate's been causing. So they actually game this out in their mind. They say, we get more by supporting Kennedy than we do by supporting Nixon. And when they present this, when Sam presents this to the commission or whatever it was, Hoffa's head just about exploded. And Marcelo was saying, but they both had to admit, yes, you're right. It does accomplish more for. So they went along with it, not happily, and not without individually supporting Nixon, but as an entity, as a group, they supported Kennedy. And so where you really see it first come into play is the West Virginia primary. And the West Virginia was 4 weeks before the election. If you looked at the polls, JFK was trailing Hubert Humphrey by 20 points. I mean, they don't vote for Catholics in West Virginia. They just don't. There was a severe anti-Catholic, and everybody who is anybody in West Virginia is a union member, the coal union, the coal mines and all the labor unions. And they're not going to vote for Kennedy unless they get pushed in that direction, because the Kennedy brothers have been just as hard on Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters and the unions and their corrupt relationship with organized crime as they have in our organized crime. So the unions are going to vote for Humphrey. And it's interesting when you talk about the 1960 election, most of the attention is on Chicago in the general election. But before the general election in the fall came the primary election in the summer. And if you don't have West Virginia, Illinois never has the opportunity to put Kennedy over the top and beat Nixon in the fall. So West Virginia, in my book, is really the trial, or it's like the testing ground to see if this will work. And when it does, they take everything they did in West Virginia to put JFK over the top to beat Hubert Humphrey. They take that and they just apply it again in Chicago and Illinois in the fall.
Is that
So if
stuffing
you
ballot
understand West
boxes?
Virginia, I'm sorry,
Is that stuffing ballot boxes, and like what to the
it's
extent?
it's not really. It's interesting. You would think that, but it's about money. They bought the vote. Uh, it started. The impetus behind this started in April when Kennedy was running against Humphrey in Wisconsin, and he was ahead. It's a progressive state, and so he thought if he could win all 10 congressional districts in Wisconsin, Humphrey would drop out. But he only won 6. And so Humphrey decided, okay, I'm gonna put all my eggs into the West Virginia basket, because that's a union state, and these union people are not going to vote for Kennedy. If I can win West Virginia, I can hang in there and maybe take this all the way to the convention. Well, so the big battleground is going to be West Virginia. And so what they did is, realizing that they're behind in these polls. I mean, Alan Otten, he was a Wall Street Journal reporter, said every miner I talked to before the primary was going to vote for Humphrey. We were fairly convinced that huge sums of money had to have traded. This is after the results are announced. How in the world does Kennedy win in West Virginia when 4 weeks earlier he's getting creamed, and everyone you're talking to is going to vote for Humphrey? Otten discovered after the primary was over that huge sums of Kennedy money had been funneled into the state, and most of it from Chicago. And Seymour Hersh, you've probably heard of Seymour Hersh. He wrote a book called The Dark Side of Camelot, claimed that the Kennedy family, and this is Joe Sr., this is just Joe Sr., which is legal. All right, this is the legal part, put $2 million into the West Virginia primary. Now, what they put it into wasn't legal. It was for bribes and for payoffs. But in addition to that was a bunch of money that was coming out of Las Vegas from the skim off the casinos. And what they learned was, if you give money to these sheriffs in West Virginia, sheriffs of all these different counties, you can go in and you can spread money around all these different committee men and other different Democrat operatives, and they won't get you to what you want, which is a victory. But if you give it to the sheriffs in West Virginia control the vote. And so what you start to see is two bag people. You've got uh, the shared girlfriend, which we haven't really talked about this story yet, but JFK was sharing a girlfriend with Sam Giancana. Her name was Judith Exner. And she would go back and forth between Chicago and Hyannisport. And she would go to Hyannisport with messages from Sam. And she would return from Hyannisport with bags of cash from Joe. And she would give it to Sam. And meanwhile, the other bag man, Frank Sinatra, is going back and forth between Las Vegas and Chicago. He's taking messages out to Skinny D'Amato, the guy who owns this casino out in Las Vegas, and Skinny D'Amato's skimming off the top, and they're putting all this money in these bags of cash in these satchels, and they give it to Frank Sinatra, and he takes it back to Chicago. So now Sam's got money coming from two parts of the country, and he gives it to a guy named McGahee. McGahee takes it to West Virginia, and gives it to Bobby and Teddy. And there's the story of one of the sheriffs out in West Virginia. His name was Victor Gabriel, and he ran the Kennedy campaign in Harrison County. And he was kind of one of the honest brokers. He didn't want all this money. He wanted enough money to run the campaign. That was all. And he said one time Bobby came to him and he showed him his little black book. And he tells Gabriel, he says, quote, "You could have gotten this." He says, to get people on the bandwagon. And he looked in the book and he said, he said there were columns of names with figures as high as $40,000 next to the names. And there were a whole bunch of names. The governor of West Virginia, Wally Barron, estimated that Kennedy's laid out between $3 and $5 million to win that primary. He said some of the sheriffs got as much as 50 grand. And they asked him, well, who ran this whole thing? He said, well, Bobby did. He was the one who set it up. And it is kind of a funny story. They weren't the only ones doing this. Hubert Humphrey was trying the same thing on the other side. And the guy who was running his little operation was a guy named Ryan Vanderzee. He's a former FBI agent. And his job was to do for Humphrey what Bobby was doing for JFK. And he thought, 4 weeks before the election, they're up 20 points. He thought it was in the bag, but he says, quote, 4 or 5 days before the primary, this is in a 1995 interview. He said, 4 or 5 days before the primary, I couldn't even get some of my people on the phone. And I said, oh my God. And I got in my car, I started driving around, and they were laying out. He said, the sheriffs, and I knew something was way wrong. Everywhere I drove, the Humphrey signs were down and the Kennedy signs were up. He says, so I met Sid Christie, who was supposed to be our man in McDowell County. And I said, what can be done? And he said, Christie told me, quote, it's too late. So then they go and he meets with Wally Barron, he and Humphrey together, the governor. And he says, what can we do? It looks like it's slipping away. And Wally Barron says, he gave us the figure of Kennedy's expenditures and said it was something we could not meet. A few years later, he said, somebody told me he watched Sid Christie receive a $40,000 payoff in a green shoebox. Is it any wonder Kennedy got 84% of the vote in McDowell County? As it started, Sid Christie was their guy. They were paying him. But the Kennedy people came in with all this mob money and Joe Kennedy Sr. money, and they paid off Sid Christie, and Christie ended up switching sides because he got more money from the Kennedys. And so, if you are familiar with Jim Marrs wrote a book called Crossfire, The Plot That Killed Kennedy. And he said between Exner and Frank Sinatra, both of them made each, so 10 trips each, back and forth between Joe Kennedy and Sam Giancana, between Skinny D'Amato's casino out in Las Vegas and Sam Giancana, 20 trips total between the two of them. It's just money's just pouring into Chicago, and it's being redirected out to West Virginia and distributed by Bobby and Teddy to all these local sheriffs. Now, after the primary and after the general, when Kennedy eventually wins, the FBI they were wise to this. And J. Edgar Hoover had wiretaps that overheard Skinny D'Amato talking about all this Las Vegas cash going out to the Kennedys. And he used this as blackmail in one of his blackmail. Uh,
You know what some of that Las Vegas cash came from, right?
well, I don't know what you're going to say. I know
Howard
what I'm.
Hughes.
Oh, yeah, yeah,
Bobby
absolutely.
Kennedy and Teddy Kennedy both had it. And surprisingly, Bobby Kennedy not as much, but Teddy Kennedy for some reason. But Howard Hughes owned a lot of these hotels that Bobby Kennedy and Ted Kennedy would stay at. And sadly, this is an area researchers don't touch upon, but they would do some of their extra activities with certain women in some of Howard Hughes's own hotels. And that's where a lot of the money, obviously, he funded both Nixon and Kennedy.
Yeah, I was
But
going to say,
yeah.
if that's true, then he was playing both sides of the fence too, because I have another story about Howard Hughes and his support of Nixon.
Which campaign are we talking about? Because he donated twice. He donated through Nixon Burger, which is Donald's or Donald
Right.
Nixon, Richard
That's
Nixon's
a
brother.
Yeah, that was a Senate election earlier on, but when in '60, Nixon actually approached Howard Hughes. They had a long-standing relationship, and it wasn't really a request to help me win the election per se. It was a request to help him get rid of Castro. And if he did that before the election, he would get credit and he would win the election. And so Hughes began, the wheels started turning on an assassination plot to kill Castro. And it started with Howard Hughes, Robert Mayhew, Johnny Rosselli, all those guys. And then they involved Sam Giancana, Santos Trafficante, Carlos Marcel, and all those people.
Which
But
isn't out of the realm of possibility with Hughes because Hughes did donate or not donate. He did try and sway President Johnson at a point because around this time when he wrote a letter to President Johnson, you can just read the letter. He was telling Mayhew that to offer Johnson $500,000 to stop the nuclear testing because he was getting paranoid at this point in his life that a lot of it was radiation and all that was going to end up messing up his hotels and also cause him to get sick because he became a germaphobe.
yep. Well, he believed he could buy any politician.
He could with the
He
money
could.
Howard
He
Hughes had.
told. Oh yeah, he told Robert Mayhew was his consigliere. He was the guy that handled everything for him, and he told Mayhew, "I can buy anybody. I can buy the presidency." And early on, they had made their bed with Nixon because Howard Hughes was tied in real tight with the national security apparatus. He
He helped
invented.
raise
He's
a
kind of like.
submarine.
Oh yeah, he came up with the spruce goose, which no one thought would even get off the ground. The plane was built out of balsa wood.
It
He was
got
the only
out
one.
off the ground 70 feet. You can watch the video, but it never
I
made
know.
wartime. It never flew in
No
any
one,
wars or
no
transported
one wanted to
tanks.
pilot the thing. I mean, he had to do it himself. But uh, that plane has become the prototype for troop transport planes that we still use to this day. He invented a sub chaser, which could go down and bring subs off the ocean floor. He was always he was kind of like the Elon Musk of his day. He was cutting edge with. He had this lust to create things and invent new things and develop new projects and get these big government contracts. And he was tied in real tight with the national security apparatus during the 50s. Well, that's Nixon. Nixon was running the 5412 committee, all the covert stuff coming out of the CIA. Nixon was in charge of. So they'd done business with Howard Hughes. Uh, this is kind of how the government operates. Guys like him and William Pauley, they're not government employees in essence. They're not CIA assets necessarily or on the payroll. They're private enterprises that do work from time to time with the government and become big assets outside the realm of the agency, and they become sort of like their go-to people. So when
Well,
when Nixon.
it's got to be prefaced that for people to understand that, you have to understand that any person that was a billionaire and hated communism was basically it was the perfect friend of the CIA or any intelligence agencies. I mean, Walt Disney's a good example, but a lot of people hear that stuff about influencing politics through whether it's organized crime or whether it's just a billionaire. We don't think of that happening today. It's unfathomable. So for my generation, you have to kind of explain that there was a context to that already. If you were against communism and you had billions of dollars and you were white, you're fit for the government at that point.
Yeah. Well, I was telling you the story of Skinny D'Amato, and he got caught on wiretaps. And this is one of the times that J. Edgar Hoover used blackmail to keep his job with the Kennedys. He says, I know what you did in West Virginia, basically. He didn't really have to spell it out, but now they realize we can't early retire J. Edgar like we thought we could. Uh, and so this is the beginning of the double cross. Right after the election, Bobby indicted Skinny D'Amato to shut him up, to keep him from talking anymore. He had him indicted. And this is the guy that basically, from his casino, made it possible for his brother to win the West Virginia primary, which made it possible for him to win the general election, become president. This is the beginning of and of course, it's not it's not incidental that it was Bobby who did it. I honestly believe this is one of the reasons why Bobby was so racked with guilt after his brother was assassinated, because it was he that was leading all the efforts to double cross organized crime. It was he that was going after them. It wasn't JFK. JFK gave him the power by making him attorney general, but it was Bobby who set the agenda. So this is what we're going to do. And in a lot of ways, JFK pays the ultimate price for what his daddy did to buy the election and for what his brother did by double crossing the deal. Now, Bobby ends up getting his too in 68. But if we're talking about 63, I think JFK is the one that it's not all their fault, but it's a big part of the reason. This is just an indication of how much money they were throwing around. Raymond Chafin, who was a West Virginia political boss in 60, wrote a book called Just Good Politics. And he said Humphrey tried to buy the primary too, but Kennedy just offered more. He gave one anecdote. He said, they asked him, the Kennedy people asked Chafin, he said, how much will it take to win your county? And Chafin replied, about 35. And he meant $3,500. Chafin got two suitcases full of cash that had $35,000 in it. So he calls the Kennedy campaign back. He says, hey, you gave me too much money. And they said, just put the cash to good use. In another boss, Logan County, which is one of the biggest counties in West Virginia, Claude Big Daddy Ellis said he got $50,000 from Kennedy's. He said JFK didn't just buy West Virginia. He didn't buy it. He just rented it for a day. And in 1996, now I don't know when you were born, Robbie, but I'm assuming it was after that. Okay, so the year before you were born, JFK Jr. Started a magazine. Now, JFK Jr. was obviously JFK's son, and he had been sort of like this playboy guy for years and years. He was very good looking, the most eligible bachelor. He was on the front of every magazine cover. It seemed like he went to law school, and he was always taking he was trying to go past the bar exam. He couldn't pass it. I mean, it took him, I don't know how many times to pass it. So everybody's always wondering what's next with JFK Jr. And he started a magazine. He called it George. And in the introductory speech, there's a famous picture of him with the George, the mock-up of the George front cover and everything. And he's introducing it to the public and everything. And he's like his dad. His daddy had a tremendous sense of humor. And JFK Jr. had a good sense of humor as well. And he said in his speech, this just shows how the Kennedy family owned what they did in 1960. They just owned it. He said, in the 1940s, my family bought the merchandise mart. In the 70s, we bought the apparel center. And in the 60 election, my family bought 20,000 votes. And everybody laughed, but that's the setting of the stage. JFK was a good campaigner. There's no question. In his own right, he probably could have won elections on his own without his daddy's help, but not in West Virginia, not in 1960. With all the legitimate campaign tactics and strategies, with the best candidate in the world, it wouldn't have mattered. He wouldn't have won West Virginia. It took all that money and muscle that Sam Giancana sent from Chicago, which turned what at one time was an 80-20 deficit into a 61% vote tally in just 4 weeks. He won 50 out of 55 counties. It worked so well. Humphrey just drops out of the race. He realizes that's it. That was my last stand. So he is now the presumed Democrat nominee, and they now turn their attention to the state that's going to decide the general election, which is Illinois. And in Illinois, the city that determines the electoral votes in Illinois is Chicago. If you win Chicago, it doesn't matter what happens downstate. You win Chicago. Well, that's Sam Giancana's home turf. So they took what they did in West Virginia and they just brought it home, and they did it again in Chicago in the fall. And Nixon knows it. It's kind of interesting. After the election, it was such a close tally, it qualified for an automatic recount. And Nixon could have contested the results. He didn't. He conceded. And there's always been a question in people's mind, why did Nixon concede? He could have got a recount. Who knows? They could have showed some voter irregularities. In the years afterwards, they were finding all these dead people that voted in Chicago. Folks were going to the graveyards and registering people to vote off tombstones. They could have found all that. He could have. But the reason Nixon didn't challenge it is because he had as many compromising connections to organized crime as Kennedy did. And any investigation of Kennedy is going to reveal his. And so he just licked his wounds and lived to fight another day. A lot of people consider it his most shining, one of his shining moments, because he didn't contest it. But that's that story of West Virginia and that deal that Joe made with Sam Giancana planted the seeds of what was fixing to happen, which was the double cross. And I haven't got into that, but I just want to tell you the story of West Virginia. That's going to be replicated in Illinois. And then when Bobby's crusade against the mob does not stop like Daddy Joe had promised, and they don't get that friend in the White House like they thought. And then when Kennedy fails to oust Castro, Bay of Pigs happens, Cuban Missile Crisis, all these opportunities to get rid of Castro, and it didn't happen. They ended up getting nothing out of the deal. They didn't get a friend in the White House. They didn't get Castro removed. They got double crossed twice. And, there are some people in this world you can double cross and get away with it. Organized crime is not one. And, Sam Giancana's name was on the line in this too. He is the one that went to his fellow mafia bosses and said, if we support Kennedy, this is what we're going to get out of the deal. And when it didn't happen, Sam Giancana's butt was on the line with his own people. And, it's one of the reasons why he ends up testifying and ends up getting killed, because he starts talking. He realizes I'm in Dutch either way I go. And so he starts talking, and so they take him out. Now that's later, but
Yeah. What about some of the stuff like when it does come to like Frank Sinatra and all this obviously connections and weird involvement with like we know Frank Sinatra's mobbed up. We know he's part of the Rat Pack and everything like that, but then we have him also somehow, I mean, a song that was never fully attributed to him, but Frank Sinatra has such a unique voice, you can't really say it's not Frank Sinatra, but does Kennedy's campaign song. So you're kind of like, the crazy thing is if you look that up, it's public domain. You it's never attributed. It says a random artist, but I'm like, that's Frank Sinatra. There's no other person in the world that sings like Frank Sinatra. His son sounds like him, but it's not. It's Frank Sinatra, and they would play it at the races all the time.
yeah. Well,
I think he muted. Yeah, there you go.
anyway, as far as Sinatra is concerned, there's this interesting story. Uh, he actually gets sent. His intermediary days were not over, evidently, because even though he toted cash all around the country for the Kennedys and Giancana in 60, when Bobby goes after organized crime after the Kennedys win the White House, organized crime is at their wits' end. How in the world could we get double crossed like this? So they send their old friend, Frank Sinatra, out to Hyannisport to meet with Joe Senior. And there's that picture. You can find it online of him with his girlfriend, Mia Farrow. and they are out at Hyannisport staying there, courtesy of Joe, but he's been sent there to give a message. And Bobby happens to be there. So it's Bobby and Joe. Sinatra hands Joe Sr. A piece of paper. It's got one name scribbled on it. And he unfolds it, and Joe Sr. reads the message, and Sinatra says to Bobby, says, quote, "This is my buddy. This is what I wanted you to know, Bob." And he does it in front of Joe. And because, and the only word that's scribbled on there is Giancana. One word. And it's supposed to remind Bobby, or maybe remind Joe of their deal, for him to put pressure on Bobby to start living up to the deal. And it's kind of like a last ditch effort by organized crime to remind Joe Sr. of the consequences for breaking that deal. If it's not said, but it's understood. If you don't come through for us, I can't stop what's fixing to happen. That's what's left unsaid. And it was Frank Sinatra who was chosen to go deliver that message to Joe Sr. Of course, there's some people who believe that Joe Sr. having that stroke was the worst thing that could have happened to JFK and Bobby, because up until the time he had that stroke, which I believe was in 61, I'm not positive, but up until the time he had that stroke, everything that the Kennedy boys did was run through the filter of Joe Sr. And he kind of looked out for them. So he makes this deal, and now they've won. Our organized crime has come through with their part, and now it's time for them to deliver. And Joe Sr. has a stroke, and it really just incapacitates him and leaves the two boys to handle the back end of the deal on their own. And whether they knew the terms of the deal or not, I don't know, but they acted like they didn't know. And with Joe Sr. incapacitated because of the stroke, Daddy's not there to guide him. And I think sometimes we forget that, Daddy guided every part of their careers up to this point. In fact, he's even the one who told JFK, "You got to put Bobby in as Attorney General so he can watch your back." He would have never done that if he thought Bobby was going to go after organized crime. And I just feel 100% certain that if Joe Sr. had not had that stroke, he would have explained the facts of life to his two boys. Because you look what Bobby did in 1961, there was 121 gangsters indicted nationwide. In 1963, 2 years later, Bobby's been on the warpath. We have 615 gangsters indicted. He has deported Carlos Marcello. He's put Jimmy Hoffa in jail. He's after Santos Trafficante. He's after Sam Giancana. He sent the FBI to follow Sam Giancana around everywhere in Chicago. He came up with this immunity thing where these mobsters would come into court and they would refuse to talk. So Bobby said, "I'm going to offer you immunity. You have to talk." And if they still wouldn't talk, he'd hold them in contempt of court, and they would be thrown in prison for 18 months at a time. And then he'd pull them out and he'd offer them immunity again after 18 months. And if they still wouldn't talk, they'd be held in contempt again. You could do that indefinitely. And so all these people in the organized crime organizations are getting put in prison over contempt violations. He called it the contempt gambit. And this was his way to try to get them to talk. You could keep them in prison forever.
Was Bobby sheltered? How did he not be aware of the fact that the mob is not someone you want to really poke a stick at?
I just honestly believe it came out in his presidential campaign, Robbie. There was stubbornness can be good, it can be bad. I think that's true. Any character quality of anybody, you can, if you take anything to an extreme, it can become bad. But in moderation, it can be very admirable. When Bobby ran for president in 68, he picked enemies with all the powerful elites, with the deep state, with intelligence, and everyone thought it was great because he just felt like a free agent to go out there. He went out to California and met with Cesar Chavez and the farm workers. He was big with civil rights. He was big with the downtrodden, the poor of our country. He was anti-war. He was taking positions out of principle that were putting him at odds with some very powerful people. But he just if you, in several interviews I've seen him talk about, it reminds me a lot of his son and what he's doing right now. There's a lot of similarities where Bobby Kennedy, uh, I guess he's junior, right? Bobby Kennedy Jr. Uh, he does not have the support of the establishment. He doesn't even have the support of his own family or the party. He's having to run as an independent. And the fights he's picking are with uh, big pharma, uh, the military industrial complex, uh, all of these entrenched institutions. Well, where did Bobby Jr. get that? He got it from his daddy. His daddy was a true believer. And I honestly believe that his fight with organized crime, partly personal, he wanted to clean up his family's name. And of course, it's the height of hypocrisy because all these organized crime figures know the only reason you're attorney general right now is because we put you in there. The only reason Kennedys have so much money is because we helped you make all that money. And he's turning his back on them. He doesn't have the long history. And so he's thinking, I'm going to be the crusader. He's got a crusader mom complex. He's a crusader, and he thinks, I'm going to clean up the family name. I'm going to clean up our country. And part of it was a personal animus he had with J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover wouldn't go after the organized crime at all. And so Bobby felt like he had to. J. Edgar Hoover, for a long time, didn't believe Cosa Nostra even existed. And so when it came to the Justice Department, he understood the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover's never going to do this work. I'm going to have to do it. And going back to your question, I don't know why he thought he could get away with it. I don't know. Uh, but he knew instantly. We were just talking about this in class yesterday. What was the first three things that Bobby did after he got that phone call from J. Edgar Hoover? Hoover calls him. He says, "Hey, your brother's dead. He was killed by a lone nut." Click. And that was the essence of the phone call. Bobby immediately gets on the phone, calls CIA, talks to a desk officer, says, "Send McCone over. I want to talk to him face to face." Then he sends Walter Sheridan to Chicago and New Orleans, says, "Go look at our mafia contacts. I think they did it. I think they were involved." And then he gets on the phone and calls his contact in the Cuban community from all the anti-Castro stuff that's been run, Operation Mongoose, all that. And he tells him, he goes, "I think one of your guys did it." He immediately identifies the three entities that now, 60 years later, are it's an acceptable position to take, that those three entities are involved in the assassination. He knew within minutes. In fact, within that week, the assassination was on the 22nd. On the 29th, he and Jackie authored a letter that they smuggled to Khrushchev. Uh, and in the letter, they said, "We know the Russians didn't do it. We want you to know that. We also know that JFK was killed by a large political group conspiracy in the United States." Within 1 week, he knows. When he saw Jack Ruby kill Lee Harvey Oswald on the Sunday when his brother's being buried, and he runs a check on Jack Ruby's phone records for the last 2 months before Jack Ruby did what he did, it's all mafia people. He's talking to Santos, he's talking to Carlos, he's talking to Sam, he's talking CIA people, he's talking to David Ferry, everybody, and he says, "If I didn't know any better, I'd think that was my subpoena list for the McClellan Committee." It's the same people. So Bobby, yes, he was a crusader, and I think he knew in the aftermath. It was one of the reasons why he wouldn't leave Jackie's side. He was, there's that famous picture of him meeting her at the airport when they're bringing Jack's body back from Dallas, and he jumps on the plane with her, and he never leaves her side. He got so close to Jackie, some people accused him of having an affair with her. He was racked with guilt. He was racked with it. And he shut down. As Attorney General, he just quit. He just quit. J. Edgar Hoover, who had that phone on his desk that came from the Attorney General's office, and he was ordered by Bobby always answer that phone whenever it rings. He took that phone, ripped it out of the cord out of the wall, and threw it in the trash. J. Edgar Hoover went on his own. He didn't pay any attention to Bobby from that point on. And Bobby basically quit and decided, I'm going to get out. I'm going to run for Senate in New York. But it was all, oh, I did neglected to mention one other thing. In that letter that he and Jackie sent to Khrushchev, there's one other piece of information that's really important. He assures Khrushchev that at some point he himself is going to run for president. And he says, basically, you're going to have to live with Johnson for a few years. And things may get rocky because he's not a peace guy like my dad or my brother was. But I'm going to run for president. I'm going to restart all of these same initiatives, these same programs that my brother started. It'll be like JFK is the president again. And in the days before the California primary, where he ends up getting killed, he admits to certain reporters, they're asking him, what's the first thing you're going to do if you become president? Are you going to reopen the investigation into your brother's death? And Bobby admits to them, well, the only way we'll ever get to the bottom of this is if the president authorizes an investigation. It has to come from a president. And he was basically signaling that that was going to be one of the things he was going to do. So he was in the process of running for president in 68. He's picking these fights with all these different powerful institutions. And then one of the last things he says is, I'm going to reopen the investigation into my brother's death. And all those people that conspired to kill his brother rise up at that point and said, oh, no, you're not. He just was a crusader. I don't think he thought about the consequences. I think he said things and he made decisions based on principle. And he says, I'll let the chips fall where they may. Jackie said, don't run for president, Bobby. The same thing that happened to Jack's going to happen to you. And Jackie had a lot of influence with Bobby. But even with Jackie, he wouldn't listen. He wouldn't listen to his daddy. He wouldn't listen to Jackie. He was one of those characters that comes along once in a lifetime or once in a generation that says, I know what I believe and I'm going to do it come hell or high water. And I believe there's all kinds of wiretap information. Carlos Marcello talking to Frank Regano talking to Santos Trafficante, Frank Regano talking to Jimmy Hoffa, and they're all talking about killing JFK. And it always goes back to one reason. Now Bobby's out of business. It always goes back to Bobby. And JFK,
Which mob figure was the one that said that after JFK died, he was like, did we get the wrong Kennedy brother?
I don't know. I haven't heard that one.
Yeah, it was either Carlos Marcello or it was because if you look at the HSCA's investigation, I've talked to plenty of people that like who work at the mob museum, and if you ask them about the Kennedy assassination, they'll talk to you about it because it does come up pretty frequent with a lot of the figures that they look at, like Santos Trafficante Sr., Santos Trafficante Jr., Jimmy Hoffa, Carlos Marcello, and Sam Giancana a little bit until his death. But there was a person who I think it was Jimmy Hoffa, but they talked about Jimmy Hoffa was like, did we get the wrong Kennedy brother? Because he was really trying to get Bobby to back off of his back. There's a famous photo of Jimmy Hoffa going like this with his middle finger in the
Yeah,
middle
I
of the
don't.
court hearings. I love that.
I have it in my PowerPoint. Carlos Marcello, it sounds like something he would say, but he's the one who decided that if you're going to take out one of them, you take out the one on top, because he's the one that used that phrase. If you take out if you take out or take off the tail of a dog, the dog will continue to bite you. But if you cut off the head, the tail ceases to be a problem. And so when Regano was the mob attorney, when Jimmy Hoffa was in prison, Regano would go see him because he represented Hoffa too. And then he'd take messages back and forth to Trafficante and to Marcello. And there was this interaction was going on between them. And Jimmy was telling Regano, give this message to Carlos and Santos. I want you to kill the president. And so Regano, and this was caught on wiretaps before the assassination, which means Hoover knew. So Regano takes that message back and he tells Santos and he tells Carlos, "You're never going to believe what Jimmy said. He says he wants you to kill the president." And in his book, Mob Lawyer, Regano recounts how neither one of them acted surprised. Neither one of them acted like, and he was surprised that by their reaction. They were like, there was no reaction. Like this was already in the works. And then uh, later, there's more interaction where Santos and Carlos tell Regano, "You go back and tell Jimmy he owes us and he owes us big." And when Regano goes back, Jimmy says, "I knew they could do it. I knew they could do it. This means Bobby is out as Attorney General." And it was always about Bobby. And but it's interesting, and this is one of the things my students ask me. Well, if they had these wiretaps before the assassination, the FBI, why didn't they stop the assassination before it happened? Which begs a question, doesn't it? Why did Hoover, who knew in advance, he had all this information from wiretaps that mafiosos at the very least, of course, now that would mean he'd have to be investigating the mafia and he'd have to do something against the mafia. He never wanted to do that. Why? What was in it for Hoover to allow the assassination to happen and then afterwards cover it up with all this tampered with evidence that they give to the Warren Commission? The FBI was just as complicit in all this. And so it's just, it leads you in a lot of different directions. But what you were asking me was about Bobby. And I just think, you know, he is the main uh, reason. I think in a movie, you always have the good guy and the bad guy, the guy in the white hat, the guy in the black
It
hat.
was Hoffa, by the way. I just looked it up.
Hoffa, who said that?
Hoffa, he said, "No, these damn Kennedys won't bother me again." Same thing kind of that LBJ said. Didn't LBJ say something along those lines that after what at the Clinton Murchison party, he talked about after
Yeah, he
tonight
told
that
Madeline Brown, he said, the Kennedys will never embarrass me again. These Kennedy sons of bitches will never embarrass me again. That's not a threat. That's a promise. And then he whispered it to her again, like she didn't hear it. And then the next morning he got up and said it to her again. And it was interesting. I had some people question me on that. And so Mae Newman, who was a housekeeper at the Murchison estate, was able to corroborate that the party happened. And all the people like Hoover was there, Nixon was there, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, yeah, that's not all. That's not all LBJ said about Bobby. There was one interaction where he said, "I'm going to slit his throat. It's the last thing I do." He said that back during 60. You know, uh, there was no love lost between Bobby and LBJ or even JFK and LBJ. That whole marriage was a marriage of politics and convenience and helping win that election. But there was no love lost, and having LBJ on that ticket, uh, my goodness, it brought the enemy right into the room because he was determined to be president one way or the other. Bobby was trying to keep him from being on the ticket in '64, so he's on the verge of indicting him. He's got all kinds of things to indict him for with Billy Celestis, with Bobby Baker, with the Henry Marshall killing, with Mac Wallace. I mean, the list was so long, it would have been hard not to indict him. LBJ was cooked. The very day JFK was assassinated, the Senate was holding committee hearings on the Bobby Baker scandal, and it was about ready to burst wide open on the very day. And of course, once he's president, all that stuff went away like that. So that's another topic. But yeah, Bobby, he in organized crime's view, there was nothing to do to Joe Sr. Joe Sr. was the one who made the deal, but he's had a stroke. He's incapacitated. He ends up ironically outliving his two boys, but not in a productive way. He was just a vegetable. But so there's no sense going after Joe Sr. So you go after the boys
why do
who
you
are
think
causing.
Rosemary was so neglected in the family, like history? Like they never talk about her. There's like one or two books maybe about her, but that's about it.
Well, it's kind of a scandal, isn't it? It's kind of a scandal what her daddy did to her. You know, today she would be probably diagnosed with ADHD or something, and she would be on some kind of medicine or whatever. She was kind of a problem child in those days, because she was outspoken. She was kind of hyperactive and things. Today, we wouldn't even blink at it. And her dad lobotomized her for it. You know, women in those days, you're talking about the 20s and 30s, they were supposed to be seen and not heard. And that daughter she was, I don't know, causing a scene. So they lobotomized her, turns her into a vegetable. And he did it without his wife's permission. His wife didn't know until it was over. I'm sure. I mean, think about that for a second. If you have a wife and your marriage produces a child, and then you go harm your child in such way, wouldn't that just irreparably harm the relationship between you and your wife? Seems like it would. And and yet she still didn't leave him. It's kind of like a mafia marriage. You can't divorce your wife. You see all these things in these mob movies, and you hear all these terrible things. They got gumas everywhere. They're killing people, all these things, but they're always in church doing confession, and they always stay with their wife. And they always say, that is sacred. You can have your guma, just keep her quiet and, over here. And that was like Joe. And so the thing with his daughter that was hugely embarrassing, it's a scandal. So, the Kennedy family to this day, they're very protective of their image. It's hard to get permission from the Kennedys if you want to do like a book, or you want to get an interview from a Kennedy about some of this history. They won't do it. And they're very zealous about watching what comes out, what is published. They'll sue you in a New York. It's kind of like LBJ's estate, same thing. Did you ever see that series by Nigel Turner from England called The Men Who Killed Kennedy? It's a 9-part series.
No, but I've been recommended to it a couple of times.
Yeah, it's hard to find. But my goodness, it is phenomenal. And the 9th episode was about the LBJ angle, and the LBJ estate sued the History Channel. Originally, the History Channel was the one putting this out, and they had to take it down. You can't even get it on Amazon anymore. I have a bootleg copy of it, but it's phenomenal. But it just shows you how there are still forces within the Kennedy family and within the LBJ estate that still watch this and protect very zealously the narrative, to the degree that they just held a press conference, 2 weeks ago, the Kennedy family, to endorse Joe Biden for president, which implicitly was a non-endorsement of their own Bobby, who's running. And they said some real terrible things about him, because it's more important to the Kennedys to protect their connections to the establishment, which is, in their case, the Democrat Party, than it is even to stand up for one of their own. I don't know if Bobby Kennedy Sr. could fit in the Kennedy family today. He would be a renegade to the Kennedys today. They would treat him the way they treat his son.
Well, the RFK Jr. stuff with his family, it's only 4 or 5 members of the Kennedy family out of the 126 that he had that have openly denounced RFK Jr. It's not the whole family. He's openly talked about this, but it's specifically the Biden supporter ones, which is what makes it really interesting. Because I wonder if he was as critical as he is now if Trump was president, would his family be rejecting him so much? I think it's just this weird thing with Biden where it's like any Democrat has to support Biden 100% and not admit any faults with his programming or something like that.
I was listening to, you ever heard Mark Grobert?
Yeah.
Okay. He was talking about the Sirhan stuff. He was actually there in the room, and they were going through he was trying to get a pardon, or not a pardon, but what do you call it? You get out of jail.
Amnesty.
Well, not amnesty. What's the word? You qualify for parole. Okay, his parole thing came up within the last year, I think, or year and a half, and Gavin Newsom was going to have to make a ruling on it.
Yeah.
And
And he
They
let
have,
Leslie Van Houten out, but didn't let Sirhan
I
out.
know, I know. And you'd think that, the Robert Kennedy Jr. is fully on board with the fact that Sirhan did not kill his daddy. He's investigated on his own, and he has said so publicly. The Sirhan deal, he was trying to qualify for parole, and so they were having a hearing. He'd made its way through the parole board had actually recommended parole. This was here within the last year and a half. So now the governor, Gavin Newsom, has to make a decision. Robert Kennedy Jr. has researched it exhaustively. It's his daddy, and he's come to the conclusion Sirhan did not kill his daddy. So, but he's not the family representative. The Kennedy family sent a representative out to argue against Sirhan's parole. And of course, that's how Gavin Newsom ruled. So he's still in jail. But I've heard Robert Kennedy Jr. talk about he knows he names the name. He names the guy who killed his dad. And but the Kennedy family again is so zealous about protecting their family image, and that it doesn't seem to show any willingness to grow with the times or with the research or with new knowledge or new evidence that comes out. I mean, the evidence that Sirhan did not kill Robert Kennedy Sr. is so overwhelming. It's just, it boggles
Well,
my mind.
that's one that's like again, the RFK assassination is one of those that are less talked about than obviously the JFK assassination, but it's not really a whole lot researched. If you look it up, there's a couple of people, and I actually spoke to a lawyer who is on the opposite side, who's trying to keep our Sirhan in prison. But he also is a JFK researcher. Like he knew Margaret Oswald when he was like 20. He went and interviewed her and got to know her personally, which was a whole different perspective. His name's John Mancino. But if you look at the RFK assassination, 11 shots were allegedly fired, and Sirhan's gun would only hold six or maybe seven. So you have to look at that. You have to look at the Sirhan must die that's written in automated writing over and over and over again in his diary, which is a sign of brainwashing or MK Ultra projects. And look, not everything is MK Ultra, but there's a lot of weird anomalies that went on in the RFK assassination. And one giant one is the LAPD destroying 6,000 things of documents in their hospital furnace. Why did they do that? Why did they destroy evidence? Why did they take ceiling tiles? Why did they take a bunch of things and destroy the evidence to that? Now, LAPD back then is involved. The LAPD were involved in a lot of corrupt activities back then in multiple different scenarios, not just the RFK assassination. I mean, the whole factor of like the Manson murders. They knew where Manson was. They had investigated and had spies on his farm over automated equipment or automotive equipment that was being stolen. That's what they charged him on. And not a lot of people know this when they raided his house before the murders happened. They were arrested and released. Why? Because they were told on higher authority that they had to release Manson. Who was the higher
Over and
authority?
over again. They were released over and over again. Going back to the Surian thing, really all it takes to make it, I think it's open and shut when you look at the autopsy report. The fatal shot came from behind. You know, the powder burns in the back of RFK's head right here.
I don't
Behind his,
trust Noguchi, though. I'm sorry.
it was considered to be the best autopsy ever conducted.
Yeah,
He was determined not to make the mistakes of the autopsy that happened with JFK. So he brought in all these experts and they did it. It was a group effort. And that autopsy, no one's been able to poke any holes in it.
see, I
And
respected Noguchi on that because he did lose his job because of that and then got rehired, but it's not the first time he lost his job. He's lost it, I think, a total of three times throughout his whole thing. And one that I've seen him change on was the death of Natalie Wood. He investigated that. Now, Noguchi brought in two people that were bruise, scarring, and pathologist experts in that area because from the work that I've spoken with a lead federal investigator, a prosecutor who did it for like 20 something years. He wrote a book about it called Sam Peroni. Um, he had his own autopsy get done with another pathologist on Natalie Wood, an examination of her. They found a fingernail mark right here on her throat and bruising around the like sides of her throat to say that she might have been grabbed and then thrown like that backwards and she happened to just fall off the back of the yacht. If you know who Natalie Wood is, the actress that drowned, Um, Noguchi made a public statement about it and called a conference because he was the corner of the stars. He actually wrote about this in his book, but he started saying that Natalie was intoxicated and tried to make it seem like she was a drunk person that just fell off of a boat and drowned. Well, Frank Sinatra wrote a letter to the head person of the LAPD. I think his name is Peter Pitches. And he told Frank Sinatra said to Peter Pitches, Noguchi needs to be seen, not heard, because he knew Natalie Wood personally, and he knew Wagner personally, and he didn't like that he was glorifying the whole, trying to make it sound like this, oh, disaster on board type scenario. He really tried to inflate it, which Noguchi tended to do with the Marilyn Monroe stuff and later on. So when it comes to the autopsy of RFK, he did do a very thorough job on that department, but I don't know because now I question all of his judgment based on his later investigations.
Well, if it was just Noguchi, I might go with you on that one, but it was a bunch of others that I've heard Cyril Leck talk about it, and Cyril Leck says best autopsy he's ever seen. So I have a
Well, it
lot
was a
of respect.
36-page report, so I mean, it was
Yeah,
pretty thorough.
I have a lot of respect for Cyril Leck, and so anyway, that to me indicates who killed. Thane Eugene Caesar is the name that Robert Kennedy throws out there, and he was CIA. So anyway, I know that's far afield from where we started, but
How? It's another brother. It's two brothers died in the exact lone saint, lone nut scenario way. Like, please examine the 60s and 70s for me. You got RFK, JFK, MLK. You could talk about Malcolm X, or you could talk about like John Lennon, all these people that somehow have
that
this.
guy in Chicago, how about that FBI guy the guy the FBI killed? The you've done some episodes on him.
Oh, Fred
Civil,
Hampton?
yeah, Hampton
Well,
too.
Fred Hampton wasn't a lone assassin scenario. I meant just specifically
Oh, but I
lone
mean, he was
assassin.
still, yeah, but he was still. It's just,
Like
yeah,
that was an op that they did during the CIA. That's their MOs. Like you look at the whole 90s and 80s. Like it seemed like their MO at that point was just people's car randomly stopping on train tracks. Like, you know what I mean? Like there's a lot of weird stuff where I'm like, this doesn't just happen in a specific time period unless it's something that was a motive or an operation or how they conducted getting rid of people. And I think you mentioned this to me, which was the CIA and their charter, the terminate with extreme prejudice.
yeah. 12 termination with extreme, which came out in the church hearings. And that was a program to eliminate people in such a way that it would look like they died of natural causes or some kind of cataclysmic event where there would be no trace of the body. You couldn't do an autopsy, you couldn't do an examination. Mostly natural causes, which when that came out in 75 is the same time church is getting to the bottom of an executive action program, which is a foreign assassination program. At the same time, he's learning about ZR rifle, and you can see him doing the math up there as he's talking to the CIA director. He's like, or not, he's actually talking to William Harvey. William Harvey is the CIA assassination expert. He says, no, wait a second. Why do we have an executive action program to assassinate people, which is wrong, but let's just say we have it. Why are we creating ZR rifle? That's a completely separate thing. Why do we have two assassination programs? What's the distinction? What's the difference? And Harvey dissembles with some bureaucratic kind of answer. And it wasn't until years later, here recently, when Mary Haverstick was able to look at the documents and come to and go back and look at William Harvey's creation document when he put ZR rifle together and determined that this was a domestic assassination program. And it was not to recruit foreign nationals to do it. It was to recruit CIA agents to do it. So that means CIA assets doing hits on a prominent American target. And so far as she can determine, there's only one target. And that program started 3 months after JFK was inaugurated, and it ended 3 months after he was assassinated, with big payouts to the assassin, the main asset who ran that program. Wow, that is groundbreaking. I can't tell you how earth-shattering that is in my mind to know that we all know about executive action. We're trying to kill Castro, we're trying to kill Lumumba, we're trying to kill all these people overseas. There's a certain amount of shock that one goes through when you realize that your own government's killing foreign heads of state, but you kind of rationalize it. You realize, well, they were enemies, or they were this, or they were that. It was wrong. We shouldn't have done it. But it's a completely different set of encyclopedias when you realize that we had a domestic assassination program that started 3 months after JFK was inaugurated and ended in March of 64, 4 months after he was killed. And it was an American target they were after, and it was using CIA assets. Wow. The CIA is not even supposed to operate on American soil, which is why they went to such lengths. I mean, it was beautifully constructed and crafted to make it look like it was another foreign program, but it wasn't. And my goodness, that just brings it home for me. That brings it home for me. That if I got nothing else out of that book by Mary Haverstick, it was that. It was that. That was groundbreaking for me because I've always in my mind wrestled with, if it was a CIA hit, if the CIA killed these people, wouldn't there be some paper trail? Wouldn't there be some program? And executive action has always been on foreign soil, using foreign nationals that they could disavow. There's never been any trace or any kind of record, documented record of anything domestic until now with ZR rifle.
I will say that I'm very happy that I came across your book and decided to reach out for you to do my show the very first time we talked. I can tell you that much. I've been so happy with each conversation we've had. I've learned you have so much knowledge in your head. It's actually pretty shocking that you can keep it all in there and be able to rattle it off.
I don't. I don't. Listen, on my show, I'll be talking and I'll forget names and I'll get these comments from my listeners. They'll be like, this was the name that you forgot. This was the, and it's so humbling because it's just so much. And you just can't, sometimes I can't recall everything. I have better days. Some days are better than others, but what helps is I try to create a story. That's how I remember things. I don't remember abstract facts in a vacuum. I have to have a story. So, like when I talk to you, sometimes you're one of the few. I do a radio show the fourth Tuesday of every month for a radio station out in Colorado. And it is absolutely the worst of me because these radio hosts are shotgunning these questions and they want 30-second answers, 30, and I can't do that. I can't tell a story in 30 seconds. And so I'm just all over the place. I hate doing that program because of the format, but you let me talk. And
Yeah.
so I'm able to tell a story, and that's how I can, in my own mind, I can make sense of things, number one. But number two, I can keep things chronologically in order and kind of unwind the story and make sense of it. So it really depends on guys like you and how you determine you want to host the show. If you let a guy talk, like Joe Rogan lets people talk. I'll tune in into Joe Rogan and listen to Robert Kennedy talk for 3 straight hours. And how many other programs will do that? And so it's really educational because everybody else wants this TV format where everything's in these sound bites. You can't talk about JFK in a sound bite.
Yeah.
You just can't.
Can't even talk about JFK at all, really.
No, you just can't. So I give you a lot of credit for it. Takes a lot of patience on your end to sit there and let someone do what I'm trying to do, which is unwind a story. We just told the whole West Virginia story, which helps you understand what happens later in Illinois and helps you understand the backstory behind the double crosses that get JFK and Bobby in trouble. But we had to have some time to tell those stories, and you gave me that time. So kudos to you.
Is there a place where people can find your YouTube channel, Twitter, any other links you'd like to promote, Barry?
Okay, well, my website is sphistory.com. So feel free to check that out. My YouTube channel is Standards Plus History Academy. And you can check that out. And I have on my website, I've got blogs, I've got books, I've got content, a lot of stuff. So anyway, sphistory.com and Standards Plus History Academy on YouTube.
All right, I'll make sure to link all those in the description. It's always a pleasure chatting again, and thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for next episode.